Here we go. State Senator Karen McConnaughay right here, 33rd District, Illinois General Assembly. Very long resume. Most importantly, she used to be the county board chairman of Kane County. She gave that up in the Rockford Broglio trade with Chris Lausitz. So, no, you guys remember that. If you're, I'm sorry. Okay, give a big hand for Karen. Next to her coming is Andy Manar, State Representative, 48th District, Illinois.
Senator. He's a
As
big shooter. State Senator. I'll introduce him. I didn't write that.
I got news for you, Andy. Neither did I. But you remember, when you come from what, Vermilion County? Macon? Macoupin County. The home of Barbara, who was from Macoupin?
Vince Musio.
Vince DiMuzio, of course. That's how I remember Macoupin. You remember Macoupin. Anyways, as I said, Senator Andy Maher, a star in the state Senate, coming all the way up here. He does have a passport and a visa. So given the new Rauner rules, when you come to Chicago, you have to, cross the line. You got to demonstrate that you're a citizen, at least of Illinois. Anyways, Andy has formerly served as chief of staff to some guy named John Cullerton, who's been here many times. He is from Macoupin County and was also the county board chairman there. Another local government guy going up, or in the other way, going down to the General Assembly. All right, batting third, Ron Sandack, a state representative. There you go. 81st District, Western Suburbs. Let's see, a lot of stuff here. Former mayor of Downers Grove, that's important. All local government people. And the fourth panelist, someone I've known a long time, Barbara Flynn Currie, 25th District. Give her a round of applause. This is streaming live to you-know-who, so you better show a little, respect. Barbara is a second-ranking member in the House, a longtime resident of Hyde Park, and Barbara, I think I remember your first election when I was there. We won't talk about it. Anyways, we have four great panelists, and to the surprise of no one and the delight of everyone, I will shut up, and we will have, starting with Karen McConaughey, a few opening comments on what you see as the, what do you see?
Wow, where do you start with that? First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It's obvious by the attendance that this is a really important issue. It certainly is to all of us. Education funding to us is the most important challenge and the most important responsibility that we have. And it's an honor to sit with three other people who I hold in high regard, and each and every one of them is concerned and losing as much sleep at night over this issue as I am. In particular, Senator Manar and I, we came in together as two former county board chairs. We've been working on this issue for 3 years now, haven't we? And I think what's interesting to note is that none of us disagree on the importance of making some changes to a funding formula that is unfair. We may have different ideas about how to get there. Some things we agree on, some things that we disagree on, but ultimately I think that there is a reason to be hopeful for the future because we see the need and we see the pathway. When you talk about what's unfair, it depends on perspective, but I think that the complexity of our current formula talks about lots of unfairness. It is unfair that, I guess if you want to call it that, CPS has a provision that allows them much greater flexibility on third-party contracting and management rights that no other school district has in the state. At the same time, CPS pays for its pension when no other school district in the state pays for its pension. So you have, right there, you have two different problems. How we fund education is terribly out of balance. When you look at a community, a district like mine, most of my communities, the property taxpayers are paying on average 90% of the total cost of educating our kids, which means we get less than, in many cases, less than 10% of funds from the state of Illinois. Downstate, where Senator Manar comes from, there's a lower tax base and a demand for more resources. One of the things that frustrates taxpayers in my district, which is part of what makes this so challenging, is when you pay a high amount of property tax in the suburbs, as I do, and you look at the city of Chicago, and I hope that I don't get thrown out of the room for saying this, but a world-class economy, a community where only about 42% of the cost of public education is coming from the property tax base. That is problematic when trying to resolve this problem, because I got to go back and be able to explain to my constituency why proportionately we pay more to educate our kids. Has nothing to do with how much money is needed. I think we all understand that long-term is going to require additional money. We all understand that we've got to put more money into it, and we have to ensure that every single child in this state gets not just an adequate education, but a high-quality education, and that includes the kids in CPS, it includes the kids in the suburbs, and it includes all the kids in downstate Illinois who will be the first ones to see their schools close if we don't get to a budget deal this week. So I'm optimistic that we're going to put our differences aside and get that resolved this week.
Round of applause. Very good. I'd like to hear now from one of my favorite state senators, Andy Manar.
Thank you. Thank you. Hope I don't disappoint. Thank you for having me. Second time in 2 months. We had a budget panel back in May, which was timely and continues to be timely to this day. This discussion today on school funding in our system in the state today is incredibly timely because of challenges that districts across the state are facing. Of course, here at CPS, in my own district back in Bunker Hill, in Macoupin County, the home of Vince DiMuzio, who frequented this room many times. Let me begin here. Our system today is completely rotten in Illinois. It's rotten at its core. It is punitive to children that live in poverty, and there's no metric that you could assess with in Illinois that would cause us to continue to preserve the system that we have today. That's a strong set of statements, but I believe it to be true, and I think as the conversation continues into year, I guess, 3 now on school funding in the Senate and in the House, that continues to be the case. Let me throw out a couple of statistics that I think ought to be troubling to everybody in this room and beyond. In the state budget, 40% of what we have, whether it's a lot or not a lot every year, only 40% asks the question, do you need it? So only 40% of the money that we have in the state budget today goes through the filter of need or demand. That's the lowest of any state in the country. Number 2, there's an inverse correlation between property tax rates and per pupil spending. And my guess is we're going to have a hefty debate about property taxes today, which we should in the state. But generally speaking, the districts with higher tax rates in the state, across the state, spend less per pupil. So much so that there are districts in Illinois today that couldn't tax themselves into equity even if they wanted to. And that's a problem. That didn't exist years ago when the current funding formula was put in place, when Senator Berman was in the Senate and led that charge. But it exists today. It's reality. So there are districts in the state that already have the highest tax rates, that are well below adequate spending, well below the state average, that couldn't tax themselves enough, even if they wanted to bring about equity to get the outcomes that we want from every school district and local school districts. A third point, we spend less on children that live in poverty as compared to children that don't live in poverty, which is opposite of what we ought to be doing with our state funds. We don't prioritize state funds to classrooms that serve children that live in poverty. It's about 81 cents on the dollar. So for every dollar that's spent on a child that doesn't live in poverty in Illinois, 81 cents is spent on a child that does, which is opposite. Other states get this right. Diverse states like Ohio get this right. They have a progressive funding formula that results in better outcomes from some of the most challenged classrooms in the state of Ohio. We could do that in Illinois. It's going to take a change in public policy. And then finally, I'll just end on this point, back to the issue of all children that live in poverty in the state, no matter where they live. On average, in a given year, a child that lives in poverty has $2,000 less spent on his or her education. $2,000 per year for 13 years. So step away from this panel discussion and think about that in the life of a child that lives in a neighborhood or a small town that has only known poverty his or her entire life. That's substantial. And that has an impact on our budget. It has an impact on outcomes of public schools, and that has to be changed. And the only way we're going to do this is either by spending more money and directing that money toward those classrooms where those children go to school, or by changing what we have today, or doing a combination of both. The State Senate has led this effort, and I'm very proud to be one voice in that effort. We've passed multiple bills over to the House, and they're being considered. And we've tried the approach of recognizing the difficult policy discussion that, Karen and I and Ron and Barbara have had for well over a year now between the House and the Senate. But something's got to change. Because despite the budget impasse, if we don't change how we direct money to schools, this problem is going to continue to plague us for years to come. Thanks again for the invitation. Look forward to the questions.
Okay. State Representative Sandack, you're up.
So it's difficult following Andy Manar in any conversation about public education because he has been a leading voice for reform, I think, for 3 years running now. And to his credit, he has been transparent and very open about what he sees as deficiencies in the system. And to his credit, he has not wavered, and he has my respect for that. But the practical sometimes has to supersede the theoretical. And where we are today, Andy first brought SB 16. It passed out of the Senate, I think it was 3 years ago, give or take. SB 1 was next. It passed out of the Senate. And most recently, SB 231. Now, they're not identical. They're principally similar, but there are technical differences, and Andy has worked very hard to move a bill that could be introduced in the House and a conversation could follow. For reasons beyond the ken of my abilities and beyond the scope of being in the minority party, those bills have never really been introduced in the House. So the folks in charge of the legislature, at least, haven't brought a unified plan towards reforming public education spending. I do think Andy's bills ought to be vetted at the House in a far more transparent manner. It just hasn't happened. I will say that anyone that knows anything about public education will say that it can be done far better. And I was thinking this weekend, the topic is it fair? And obviously fairness is always in the eyes of the beholder. It's entirely subjective. But I think almost anyone with that pays 5 minutes attention to public education and has a conscience would say, at the very least, it's outdated, it has bad outcomes, and could be done and should be done far better. Fairness, in all fairness, is a destination that we constantly look to achieve. I don't know that we do it in any realm of state government. I don't think higher education is funded fair. I don't think how we fund public infrastructure. You ask those that bid on those contracts if it's a fair process, you may hear some grumbling. In fact, if you're not, unless you live under a rock, you know that we're having a little bit of a problem finding a budget solution on a macro level in Illinois. That's entirely unfair. So while I was, noodling this concept, a couple things came to me. One, we should be working on this far better. We're not doing it right. So the Senate sends over some concepts to the House, which have yet to be meaningfully addressed. The Majority Leader, Barbara Flynn Currie, has led a year-long bipartisan process. I'm in that committee. We have met. We have heard from superintendents, stakeholders, from all aspects and segments of Illinois education. Now, we haven't drafted a bill. We haven't done anything different for the formula. In fact, the bill the Democrats in the House passed out and sent to the Senate on a macro level, which was a funding budget for everything, had more money in it for education, for CPS, but it didn't change the funding formula. And when the bill that the K through 12 bill that came over from the Senate went down in flames in the House. So we're doing it wrong. We ought to be doing it far different. Republicans had a unified plan that hasn't seen the light of day, such as the life of the feckless minority. But we ought to be doing it differently. We ought to be working in bipartisan groups. We could start with Andy's bill or any other bill. And frankly, there's other bills out there too. Senator Berrickman, Andy's colleague and Karen's colleague in the Senate, has kind of an evidence-based proposal. Will Davis in the House has an evidence-based model. There are other, I think Senator Lightfoot has a bill. There's bills out there. Now, we've never put them in the House. We don't take them out of committee and vet them, which I have a fundamental process problem with. I think we ought to be doing that. I think we ought to be doing far more in a transparent manner to fix an outdated, overly complex, burdensome calculation, if you will. We can be doing it far simpler. And I'll say one more thing before we pass it along. Karen and Andy made reference to it. I'm a suburban legislator. You want to get people all ginned up, come to the western suburbs and talk about property taxes, because they're outrageous. They are absolutely outrageous. A full 90% of my tax bill goes to pay for my K through 12 and higher education. Do I like how it's allocated? Did I have any voice in how it's allocated? Those are, I think, rhetorical questions to a large extent. But you want to gin up a voter? Tell him or her that they have to pay more in taxes, which has been essentially what the funding discussion has boiled down to for many suburban voters. I'd prefer far more evidence, outcome-based processes that talked about trying to find baselines for everyone, whether you're from Naperville, Hyde Park, Bunker Hill, wherever. We got to be doing this better, and I think we can. We can finally get towards the road towards fairness, or move towards fairness, but we have to do it far better.
Okay, round of applause for Barbara, you're up.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank all of you for being here. I'm delighted to be part of this very distinguished panel, people who are truly experts in state government and education reform. Senator Manar is absolutely right. We treat the least among us in a totally shabby, inappropriate, shameful fashion. $2,000 per year per child, $2,400 per year per child, if that child happens to be a member of a minority group and also someone who lives in poverty. I'd have to first say, having been in the Assembly for some time, I know it's my fault we haven't solved the problem by now. In any case, I'm still working on it. That this is not a new problem. Senator Berman is here, and many years ago, Senator Berman was picking up the cudgels for a fairer system of funding public education. Communities like Fort Heights, communities in the south suburbs, for example, Andy is right, no matter how heavily they tax themselves, they still will not put enough money into the system to do an adequate job for the children in their classrooms. Part of the problem, I would say, is that the state itself has not stepped up to the plate. So the average property tax dollar in Illinois, 60 cents goes to pay for public schools. The rest for other kinds of municipal and other services. Nationwide, that number is closer to 40 cents on the dollar. So when you complain, Ron, that your property taxes are too high, it's partly because state government has failed to step up to the plate. Now, I have great admiration for Senator Manar, who did yeoman's work over these last several years, trying to put together a program that was adequate to the task of promoting equity and also responded to the problems that developed along the way. When you go from a theoretical formula, all of a sudden someone says, oh, wait a minute, you forgot about this issue or that. So he did the fine-tuning that was necessary. But the difficulty that I would say we confront is, as someone who's led the task force that Ron mentioned over the last 2 years, there's not a single person that's come before our task force who has not agreed that school funding in Illinois is inequitable. But what people are also concerned about is the level of adequacy. So let me give you an example. A superintendent from a relatively well-off community in DuPage County. Over time, it turns out that his school district now, about 30%, about a third of the students are low income, and many of them are English language learners. Under the proposals that Senator Manar has pressed appropriately, he would lose $5 million. Well, his view is that he doesn't have the resources if he wants to do what those low-income kids need in his area. He doesn't have the resources to fill the gap. So I would say that one of the things we really ought to be doing, and one of the things Senator Berman worked on in 1995 when former Governor Jim Edgar was in charge, was a program that would actually raise some additional resources so that we could do a better job overall. At the same time, we are looking specifically at the major issue of inequity in today's funding system. So we are working on that in my task force. The budget working group that the governor has asked people to come together with doesn't have long-term solutions yet, but I'm hopeful that at some point we will figure it out. One of the charges the governor gave, not to the stopgap budget working group, but to the earlier one, was find the resources we need, as well as the cuts we must make in order to be able to make Illinois whole. Well, that's an effort that we're still engaged in, and it would, I would say, behoove us to continue that progress, make sure that we make progress, and come back to the governor, the leaders, and our colleagues in the House and Senate, and say, here, finally, we can get a job done.
Thank you. If you have questions, one of the people who are outside will be coming in to collect those questions. There she is, little Caitlin. All right, if you have a question, raise your hand. The professor will start off, like Lawrence Spivak, Mr. Roebling. You remember him. Thank you, Phil. I've taught this for, well, as long as Barbara's been in the House. And all of you are articulate, all of you are correct in what you say, but still, this is like a tennis match, and each one's using a different ball. You're not hitting back the balls to each other. Moreover, the property tax issue is a big issue. I was a former suburbanite office holder. One thing property taxpayers do have, it's tax deductible. And they take it off the top of their income tax. And it goes for their own schools. So, 4 words. Paula Wolf's not here, right? Good. I basically limit any discussion of any of this to 4 words. Who pays, who gets? Who pays? You all say someone, you need more money. Who's going to pay? Who's going to get? That's the issue. All of your articulate discussion is right on target, but the key issue is who pays? If you need more money, if it's an equitable funding, fine. Where's the money going to come from? Who's going to pay? Are suburban property tax owners going to pay more state income tax for that, so that those dollars go to the state and they don't go to their district? Tough sell. Or in Chicago, where you're paying your own pension costs, everyone, and you're also paying for everybody else's, what about them? Who's going to pay? Where is the money going to come from? And last but not least, because I am the king of cheap shots, I know one place you're not going to go. That's, of course, to the Friends of the Park. So if had to do it. Okay, anyone wants to jump in? Who pays, who gets? How are you going to get more revenue, and where's it going to come from? Don't all jump at once.
Well, as I said, as a member of the governor's long-term working group, we have been looking at questions about revenue, how we could get more, and how we could solve some of the problems that we are facing, not just problems in education. You know, there was a report from United Way that said that there are 1 million people out there in need of social services who aren't getting any because the state can't do a stable long-term budget. 45% of the state social service agencies are laying people off. It's not only the schools that need stability and need fair and adequate funding, but it's a whole range of social. I understand that the people who provide food in the state prisons aren't getting paid. And we all know that there is a crisis in road construction. If we don't start soon, the summer will be over, and there is at this point no capital budget in order to make roads work. So we have a lot of problems, not just the one we are discussing today, and I'm hopeful that we can figure out, as the governor's mission says, a grand bargain in this working group that would solve the problems with new revenues and with significant cuts in state spending.
Anyone else jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in. We referenced earlier the evidence-based model that is beginning to build a lot of bipartisan support in the General Assembly, and one of the reasons for that is that when you talk about funding, the concept is the funding tracks with the child and that individual child's needs, whatever that might be for that child. That's how you determine the amount of funding. So a child in poverty gets the same consideration, whether from the city of Chicago, from the suburbs, or downstate. That combined with the formula directly addresses ability to pay. So not what you're paying in property tax, not what your assessed value is, but what is your community's ability to pay. There is, Senator Manar has a very different property tax challenge in his part of the state than I have. But at the end of the day, we're still paying high property tax. The ability to demonstrate a level of transparency where you can identify how children are how their education is being funded and who's contributing what, makes it a lot easier. My communities will probably pay the same, maybe even more under that kind of a formula change, but it's transparent and it's based on local ability to pay. So I think that is one of the ways that we can look at that going forward. How do we get to something that all of us can live with? And it is one of the areas where we're beginning to build some bipartisan support.
Yeah, let me make the point that we shouldn't just ask the question who's going to pay and who gets what. We should ask the question what's affordable. We have to ask what's affordable too. And I think the bill that is my mic going to go off?
I really like this.
Yeah, I just failed.
Yeah.
I just failed.
No, been at least, 10 minutes?
So we have to ask what's affordable. And Leader Currie mentioned Senate Bill 231. There's a cost associated with that bill, but there should be a cost associated to improving a system. We tried improving a system at a neutral cost, and that was Senate Bill 16. And that was rejected by just about every Republican in the legislature because, according to those words, it set up a system of winners and losers. So we attempted the approach of trying to change the system using current resources, and that was rejected. Senate Bill 231, which is pending in the House, builds in hold harmless provisions, is phased in over time. That comes with a cost that's associated that has to be paid for. It has to be paid for, which means we have to have a revenue conversation, not just to address our structural problems with our budget, but with structural problems with school funding. So it's an affordable option. That's my point. 231 is an affordable option to begin that transition into a new system to right the wrongs that we have in the state today.
And the
Professor,
evidence-
let me answer the question. I'll try and be far more succinct. It was structured, SB 16 and SB 1 was structured where the suburbs paid and the city and other school districts received. That was the equation then. Senator Manar has put forward a new proposition. It has not been vetted at all in the House. Good, bad, right, or wrong. Again, I don't set the docket. I can't get anything out of rules, let alone on the floor. So I'd love to have that debate. But the fact of the matter is, the structures we have seen has been bad for suburban voters, and it's been subsidizing other parts of the state. That's not kosher to my voters, so I'm never going to vote for it. Surprise. Would I like something that is far more evidence-based, that's far more equitable, that addresses adequacy fairly? Look, no one wants any kid to not get a good education. She or he is entitled to some baselines, and frankly, the formula that now exists tries to do that, but as Barbara said, over the years, it's become so complex and multi-leveled, it's unmanageable. We can and should do better, but right now, what was before us, and we never got the chance to talk about 231, what we talked about hypothetically was where suburbs paid more, and that was just patently unfair.
So,
Okay.
may I respond?
Sure, quick.
Okay. Which suburbs? So in Senate Bill
Fort Heights.
231, let's dive into CPS. Let's dive into this. Senate Bill 231 has been called a bailout. Options that have been, filed in both the House and the Senate have been tabbed with that word. But the bill the Senate passed, there were 104 school districts that received more money proportionally per student than CPS. 56 of those were in the suburbs. 56 of those school districts were in the suburbs for the fact that they're underfunded today. There are suburban communities in Illinois today that have underfunded classrooms that pay the highest property taxes in the state of Illinois. And the current funding formula, the proposal that the governor's put forward, doubles down on that approach. It digs that hole deeper for another year so that when we finally decide to get out of the hole, we have a bigger hole to climb out of. That's why I think we need to change this system today. So I just want to be careful about, putting the state into these geographic sections, which, puts roadblocks in front of us to have the conversation about how to have reform.
Okay.
In that bill, it was split between the suburbs and downstate. CPS was 105th on the winner list, as it's called. But let's remember, the suburbs, it's not a cohesive group of school districts. There are districts in the suburbs that are underfunded today.
You meant
I would just wanna
not paying
add
the
if
most
I-
in property taxes, the highest property tax rates.
Rates, correct.
Right,
Right.
right, there's a difference.
Dollars
All right,
versus
here we go.
rates, right.
We'll get back to this. Barbara, it's not so easy controlling all this, is it?
I was going to say the evidence-based model, of course, would also require additional resources. I think the price tag they've set is about $5 billion. So there's nothing about school reform funding that is going to be inexpensive. The reality is you can't do it on the cheap, and that's part of the reason we are in trouble today. And you talk about who gets, who pays. Well, right now, in the suburbs that are affluent, they are paying a very significant share of their property tax dollars to fund their schools. And that's, again, back to the main point, and that is that the state is not stepping up to the plate. And until the state does, property taxes will be the major force funding schools across the state of Illinois. A big problem if you're Fort Heights, because you don't have property value. It's a different kind of problem for Ron Sandack's district and for Karen McConaughey's, but it doesn't mean that it isn't a problem because they are cranky about their property. Although I must point out, there was some talk earlier about Chicago's property taxes and what happens in the suburbs. It turns out that the operating tax rate for Chicago Public Schools is higher than it is in any of the school districts in Ron Sandack's district. I thought I'd just mention that. Now, you
Just
bring
throw that in.
I would be
you
happy
bring
to
in-
compare
you-
property
you
tax
bring
bills
in-
with you any day of the week, right?
You bring in a lot of money with your tax
Oh,
rate, so I.
Yeah.
All right, all right. We got a lot of questions. And I was showing uncharacteristic restraint for not responding to all that because I am the moderator. And let's get going. State Controller Leslie Munger, you sent me an essay. I will try and read it. Today, the cost of pension contributions is nearly 25% of our state's budget. Next year, it will be higher. We spend $8 billion. Is that billion? We should be spending about $2 billion. How about working aggressively on constitutional pension reform to bring those costs down so we can direct some of that savings to education rather than limit it to the state dollars of suburban districts who already pay the highest property taxes in the country? Sounds like she's running for office, doesn't it? All right. Well said. Well said. Who wants to comment on that? Here.
She's right.
All in.
Yeah, we're
It's
for
been a
it.
problem since I've been in the General Assembly. She's
before.
right. We spend way too much on pensions, and it's draining resources in such a way as we short infrastructure, we short higher ed, we short K through 12 funding. We short because we pay so much in pensions.
But it's difficult to find a way out that is constitutionally legitimate. And in fact, the legislature sponsored bills 2 years ago that said we're going to restructure pensions for those currently retired or members of the workforce, and the court said, you can't. They said, no, you may not. And they didn't provide us a roadmap that said if you did A, B, or C, that would be okay. They basically said, for current and retired state employees, we're shutting the door. Now, starting in 2011, new hires have come under a very different kind of pension system, and that's totally legitimate. So we're trying to work through, are there options, for example, offering to current state employees a different kind of program? Would enough of them accept it? Would it save enough money? Would even that meet constitutional scrutiny under the terms that the Illinois Supreme Court has set? But we're all not only aware of it, but we're all working hard on it because, yeah, you can't fund all those social services, education funding reform if you are spending all of your money on pensions.
Okay. No. Eileen Makovich, where are you? Raise your hand. There. Well, Eileen, you'll be moving on up. What about private corporations and foundations supporting schools in their district? Miss Albertine? No, you're not. Go ahead. Anyone. Private foundations and corporations basically funding schools.
Well, I wouldn't say funding schools, but I do think that the corporate community does a lot to step up to the plate and help us out. There, in my neighborhood, there were people from, I think it was AT&T, who were painting school rooms, hallways, what have you. That's a wonderful kind of thing, and some of them do help promote and train people who might decide they want to become teachers. I don't think we can turn the basic funding proposition over to the private sector, but I am grateful for all the help we can get.
Anybody else want to jump in? Okay, Wendy Catton, where are you, Wendy?
Raise your hand.
Frequent
Raise
speaker
your
here,
hand.
very shy, demure, very shy, right, Wendy? Very shy and demure. Here we go. What specific revenue proposals do you support to fund public schools adequately? Hearing lots of analysis and not many solutions. And well, we had that. And do you support pension parity? Kind of a mild question coming from Wendy, to be honest with you.
Well, I certainly support pension parity. In fact, if we had pension parity, if Chicago were responsible for everybody's pension, but not only responsible for its own, we would be spending, since Chicago are 20% of the students, and we're spending about $4 billion on downstate teacher pensions in the coming fiscal year, that means we'd be giving $800 million new dollars to Chicago. I could be for that.
Of course she could. She could also be, and I could be for that too, if we had Chicago grant block parity, if we
Okay,
had
I'll
third-party contracting parity,
We'll
if we had
trade.
PE parity,
We'll
if we had
trade.
driver's ed parity.
We'll trade.
Everything we do in Springfield, by and large, I've learned this was the neophyte, again, suburban Republican, when you see a bill that has certain proximity and or population parameters around it, it tends to be a for Chicago
Or
piece of
against.
legislation or against Chicago piece of legislation. We, for decades, separated the state geographically. To Andy's point, I think he's right. We shouldn't be doing this on education. We largely shouldn't be doing it at all. Certainly, there are aspects of our state that are unique and diverse and should be, identified sometimes, but never isolated. So I'm for pension parity so long as we have education parity and we have funding parity and we have parity as a whole. When that day comes, you'll see me with the majority leader on the pension parity vote.
You're doing kumbaya. It's a kind of pretty picture.
Okay. Chris, help me with your last name. Grozev? Not bad. Okay, and by the way, I don't know, like some of you who write this big, Chris has very good printing. Here we go. When can we expect, oh, Jesus, nice printing, nice soft question. When can we expect Chicago public school teachers to pay the 9.4% into their retirement portfolios that they haven't paid in years, or at least to contribute more than they are now? Wouldn't this help the funding formula?
Barbara,
I'll
you wanna
answer it,
take
yes.
First of all, there are many school districts that have contracts with their teachers that say that the district will pick up the pension cost. And let me tell you that, in fact, often it's a really good deal for the district. Because if you just put that money in salary, that really is true. So if you put the money in salary, you raise the base. So next year, if you're talking about salary negotiations, you're starting from a higher base. If instead you're picking up some portion of the pension payment, then the school district doesn't have to start from a higher base when contract negotiations happen next. This is not just a Chicago issue. I'm prepared to let the people in Chicago negotiate their contract and make a decision about what they do with the pension payment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would echo
Thanks, Currie.
the leader's remarks. We don't tell the Decatur School District how to negotiate a contract when it comes to their teachers. We don't tell Harrisburg how to negotiate their contract. We leave it up to the locally elected school board and their administration and those that have a say-so in these decisions. Back up to the cost of pensions in the budget for a moment. The TRS payment, and maybe the comptroller could correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's going up about $300 million this year from FY 16 to the proposed 17 budget to
It'll
make
be
the
about
complete
$4
payment.
billion.
So there's no debate about paying that. There's no debate in Springfield about do we or do we not pay the increased cost of pensions for TRS. It's being paid. There isn't a word of debate about that. So when it comes to the Chicago Teacher Pension Fund, there's a flurry of debate. And the question is, how are we or are we going to pay for it? And so this idea that we can reform schools without addressing the Chicago Teacher Pension Fund, to me, is complete nonsense. We have to do it. And believe me, it doesn't get me any votes in my district by saying this, but it has to be done one way or the other. We have to take steps toward that parity. It's not going to happen overnight, but it can happen and it has to be done.
And efforts in the House and the Senate this spring were really geared in that direction. So one of the bills that passed the House that provided an equity grant that was much more beneficial to school districts that were in economic need outside the city of Chicago than to Chicago itself. Same thing was true of the bill that passed the Senate. Both of those bills provided some support for the Chicago Teacher Pension Fund, just in terms of operating support. I think the Senate version gave them about $200 million, which is the operations cost. The House was only half as generous. It's so like the House, half as generous as the Senate. But in any case, both chambers did say, yeah, we should begin to do something, and we started with the actual costs of the coming year, of the new costs that the system would incur.
Well, this is definitely an area that when you talk about fairness, there's unfairness about this across the state, not just in the city, not just downstate, because except for the city of Chicago, every school district essentially has the luxury of negotiating and not worrying about paying the bill. So they can agree to pick up the employee's portion of the pension contribution and not have to worry about how it's being paid for, because that's what we do at the state. Then we have to try to figure out how to meet that obligation. This is another area where, again, we're not all anti-Chicago. This is another element that really contributes to what brings the whole system down.
Okay, moving on. By the way, a lot of questions. Many of them are similar, so I'm skipping over them. Carolyn Balicki, where are you, Carolyn? All right. CPS parent. This is for you, Karen. Not in your district, so you could swing for the fences. Are you advocating vouchers within Illinois?
Here's the thing about vouchers. I think that's a decision that should be made on a district-by-district basis, because vouchers may be an important tool in a school district's portfolio in one school district and may not have any relevancy in another. This really speaks, in my mind, to the ability to empower our local school districts to make as many of their own decisions as they possibly can.
Okay, this one's for you, Ron. Get ready. You know what's coming. This is from Tom McDougal. Where are you, Tom? Doesn't want to raise it. Right over there. Close. Okay.
He's my constituent, be careful.
This is to Ron. Are you saying that your wealthier voters are unwilling to help fund education for poorer children? That's not a sandbag. That's just a straightforward question.
I want you to know.
Absolutely not. We're doing it right now. So
Tom is my
not.
constituent. I just want you to know that for the record.
God love the City Club, right? Sandbagging all
can I
over
just
the place.
A
All
little
right.
historical footnote, and that again, when Arthur Berman was in the state Senate, he carried the bill. I was the House sponsor, Governor Edgar's bill, and what that provided was an increase, oh my heavens, think about it, in the state individual income tax to do a better job of funding school districts, particularly those that were filled with children with high levels of poverty. And you know what? The bill passed the House with votes to spare, Republican and Democratic votes. It got stuck in the Senate because one of my favorite Chicago haters, Philip, was then the guy in charge of what got heard in the Senate. But it is not unprecedented to say that people who represent people with more wealth would be willing to step up to the plate, and that was an example.
I think just because you're in a position where you have to explain the challenge from your voters, your taxpayers' perspective, doesn't mean that you're not committed to providing the very best for all
That's
children in Illinois. But it's a complex issue, and when you want to know why Ron Sandack and I are not voting for something, you want to understand what is going on in our districts that cause us not to support something. That's part of what our challenge here is to get to some place where we can afford to do something for all kids. I mean, that's what we're going to be dealing with this coming Wednesday. We've got competing competing proposals. We're coming from a position that let's do something short term that gets kids back into school, open school on time, something that we can afford. There's a counter proposal that says we got to throw another $700 million at it. Where's that money coming from? This is the kind of discussion, because guess what? When I go back to my district, if I vote, I may think, even if I think that 700 million is worthwhile, I have to explain to my taxpayers, because they're going to be picking up part of that tab, why was that relevant? That's why moving to formulas and a way of doing things that offer the greatest transparency allows us to indicate, wherever you come from in the state, that you are doing a fair and adequate job of providing education for all children. I care about the kids in Andy's district, where they have classrooms where they have one computer for an entire classroom. Sometimes they don't even have that. Is that morally, we have an obligation to make sure that those kids have the same quality education that the kids in my district have. So just because we explain and have to represent our districts doesn't mean that we're not equal. Wouldn't be up here. I wouldn't be spending all the time with Andy Manar I've been for the last 3 years.
No, that gotta hurt his feelings.
I love him dearly.
All right. We have a couple of more questions. A lot of these are repetitious, and we have one from Ed Sullivan.
Oh, my God.
There he is.
There he is. A nice moderate question. Should I read it? You're ready for it. Here we go. You wrote it. A measure of taxpayer fairness is the percent of value of a house paid in property taxes. House in Lake County typically pays 3.4% of the value. Is that a fact? Yes. Okay. Parts of Chicago pay only 1.5% of the value. How does the reform discussion address this inequity? Is it inequality? That's a very fair Sandack question. Andy, why don't you take it?
Well, we could talk about classification.
By the way, before you take it, this is more pub for Art Berman in the history of this club than today. And Pate Phillips' name has been mentioned for the first time ever. Go ahead, Andy.
Part of, and Representative Sullivan knows that part of our discussion in the Senate has been how do we devote more resources to CPS pensions. You know, I think on 2 occasions we've passed out of the Senate a bill that would allow the city to raise its property taxes, to devote that money to help shoring up that pension system that needs it. I've said consistently myself throughout our hearing process for the last 2 years that this absolutely has to be part of the conversation. There's reasons why it is the way it is. I'm less interested in the reasons. I'm more interested in trying to find parity on pensions, on property taxes, which you articulated in the question, on how we devote more resources to students that live in poverty, whether they live in Lake County or, you know, in Alexander County, in the deep southern part of the state, but absolutely has to be part of the conversation.
Right.
We've advanced that measure twice in the Senate.
And the House, I believe, has also passed legislation twice that would say that there will be a levy specific to pensions in the city of Chicago, and I believe, Representative Sullivan, you voted for it too. So thanks for your vote.
Well, he's going to always vote for something where Chicagoans pay for Chicago,
Yeah.
benefits.
Yeah.
But Ed's point is, you heard the concept of pension parity. That's a fair point. Property tax parity is not something that I've heard a heck of a lot of from proponents of either school funding or any other aspect of some things that, that happen in Springfield. So I was pleased to hear Andy talk about that. That needs to be part and parcel of the process. So if we're going to have pension parity, property tax parity, frankly, governance parity with respect to some of the things that CPS can do that other schools cannot do, I think we now have a framework where we can start moving ahead. But those things have been disparate and not, at least in the bill that I've seen, that I've been able to vote on, those have not been something introduced on the floor just yet.
Well, except also it's worth pointing out that the Chicago operating tax rate for public schools is pretty high compared, as I said, for example, to the schools in Representative Sandack's district. The difference is that in Cook County, there's classification of real property. So you may bring in the same total amount, but the mix of payers is somewhat different. And that's a whole separate discussion. And I would just
I'm fine for assessment parity too, if you want to add that one to the gig.
No, it's not assessment,
because
it's classification.
Yeah,
So,
because I think you have one assessor for a county that certainly
Township.
classifies properties in a very unique way. So I'm all for assessor parity too,
Anyway,
Representative. I think that's cool.
I just want to pick up on what Senator McConnaughay is saying. I think no one suggests for a minute that people like Ron and Karen are not concerned about taking care of the least among us, the children who come from the poorest of backgrounds. Of course they want to do. But maybe it would help the discussion if we were able to fix this problem that so much of our schools funding relies upon property taxes. Your property taxpayers are legitimately cranky because they are paying a very significant sum for schools. If they were living in Ohio, if they were living in California, if they were living in New Jersey, they would not be spending that larger portion of their property tax dollar to fund public education. So if we can find a way out of that morass, it would help not only with the overall funding problem, but it might help you explain to your taxpayers why some different kind of funding for public education is actually an advantage to them.
Good answer. By the way, I hope you caught how some people are voting. She threw that off the top of her head. You can see why you're batting number 2, Ms. Currie. That's a very impressive display there for all you fans of the legislature. Now we have one question from Lisa Kulsik discussing the issue of race, and I don't think we need to get onto that because we're talking about, I don't think anyone's going to say this is all racism, so we'll just skip that one. Also, Jennifer Burrows, Illinois ranks 48 out of 50 in funding for yes? No, if I mischaracterize it, I mean, kind of small print for me, too. You know, you caught me. Blah, 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 blah. Your daughter's doing great in Chicago, and, well, what's the question? Stand up and say, well, in the 2 sentences. Okay, thank you.
Right.
Very good question. Sorry for not reading the whole thing, but you basically said it verbatim. I'm sure you all want to jump on that one. Go right ahead.
You know, can I just say something about this?
Yeah,
Not to get into a totally different subject, but this really, in my mind, plays to how we redistricting and how we draw districts in the state of Illinois. Before I came to the General Assembly, I was chair of the Kane County Board, where I had a diverse population of Hispanic, African American, white, all levels of income, challenging neighborhoods, affluent neighborhoods, and I found it a lot. I found it that I could do I was doing a better job when I had a diversity of interests and demographics to represent. It put me in a position where I had to do what the right thing was for everybody. The way our districts are drawn, I will tell you, I have less than 5% minorities in my district. That's atrocious. How is a representative, whether it's a representative or a senator, is supposed to understand the challenges? We have a multitude of challenges across the state. But the way our districts are drawn, we have very limited demographics of voters that we serve. So what I have to deal with is completely unrelatable to most legislators that come from the city of Chicago, and that's wrong. Anyway, sorry.
I guess I would just say that geography and race tend to go together in our society and in our state. So it isn't surprising that there may be affluent, mostly white suburban territory where people like Karen get to be the state senator. And in fact, one of the things about our current system of drawing maps in Illinois is that there is a very clear mandate that people may not find themselves victims of discrimination based on race, based on ethnicity. So there is a very high value in our system of drawing maps that says that you can't district so that African American communities, Latino communities, even Asian American communities are left before you even get to the starting block. So that is important, and if race didn't go with geography, we would not have that problem.
That is someone who's testified many times before the various redistricting commissions and written about it. Absolutely true. And that's what's going to happen to this new effort. The people who are going to be against it are going to be minorities because they're going to be either stretched out where they can't elect somebody of their choice, or they're going to be stacked where they're going to have only people of their same race. So your question's good in a perfect society, but the way this works out, it's going to be a real battle because the people who you think you're helping are the people who are going to be against it. Well, how about a big round of applause?